It's funny how the most unexpected moments in life can change everything. That's how I met Eleanor by chance, but it felt like fate. I had always thought I knew exactly what I wanted in a woman, but the moment I saw her, I realized I hadn't even known what I'd been missing. It was at a local cafe, one of those cozy little places where everyone knows your name. She was sitting alone, sipping coffee, with a book open in front of her. She had that air of quiet confidence, not the kind that screamed for attention, but the kind that made you want to pay attention. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes were a soft green, intense, yet welcoming. I don't even remember what compelled me to speak to her. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely at ease in her own company, or how effortlessly beautiful she was without trying. I don't think she even noticed me at first, but once she did, there was an immediate connection. I wasn't the type to approach women often too shy, too reserved, but with Eleanor, I felt something pull me in, like I was meant to be there. We talked about everything: books, music, movies, but mostly we talked about life. She was smart, witty, and so incredibly kind. I was drawn to her in a way that felt almost magnetic. As we spent more time together, I started to realize how easy it was to be with her, how comfortable and natural it felt. We had our differences. Of course, her background was different from mine. Her life experiences were worlds apart from mine, but it didn't matter. We fit together like two pieces of a puzzle. The proposal came a year later, in the same cafe where we first met. I had been planning it for months, but when I finally got down on one knee, everything felt so surreal. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, I was terrified she might say no, but then she smiled. A slow, warm smile that lit up her face, and she said yes. That day, I felt as if the universe had finally aligned. Eleanor had made me a better man, and I couldn't wait to spend the rest of my life with her. Our wedding day arrived like a dream. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over everything. The air was warm with the scent of roses, and the world felt still, as if everything had paused to witness the most important moment of my life. Eleanor was breathtaking. She stood there in her white dress, looking like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. The intricate lace, the soft fabric that clung to her in all the right places, it was as if she was a vision I had conjured up in my dreams. When she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with her father's, I thought I might faint from the sheer beauty of the moment. Her smile was so genuine, so full of love, it took my breath away. And as we exchanged our vows, promising to love and cherish one another forever, I felt the weight of the commitment. We were more than just a couple. We were two halves of a whole, bound together by fate, love, and trust. The ceremony was everything we had dreamed of, perfect in every way. The guests were all smiling, everyone was in good spirits, and there was laughter, joy, and the promise of a future filled with hope. I took so many photos, capturing every moment, because I wanted to remember it all: every glance, every touch, every word exchanged. I wanted to lock away this memory in my heart forever, to hold it close, because I knew that this was the happiest I would ever feel. Later that evening, we left the reception, our hands intertwined as we made our way to the car. The laughter of our friends and family faded behind us as we drove away, and I could feel the excitement building. We were finally starting our life together. After our perfect wedding, Eleanor and I ventured to France for our honeymoon. It was supposed to be the beginning of our new life, filled with love and adventure. We had chosen an old mansion deep in the French countryside, far from the noise of the city, surrounded by misty forests and the quiet murmur of nature. The house had an air of charm despite its obvious age. The stone walls were covered in thick ivy, creeping and curling like ancient veins. The windows were adorned with faded lace curtains that fluttered in the slightest breeze, adding a ghostly, almost melancholic touch to the place. There was a certain magic about it, something that captivated Eleanor immediately. She couldn't stop smiling as she wandered through the old, dusty halls. But on our first night, I noticed something in her eyes that wasn't quite right. She was tense, unsettled, as if something was lurking just beyond her reach, something she couldn't see but could feel. The warmth of our wedding night had quickly evaporated into a cold discomfort that I couldn't explain. Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her eyes darted around the room as if watching for shadows, her body stiff and restless. I tried to comfort her, pulling her into my arms, whispering soothing words to calm her nerves. But nothing seemed to settle her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, staring at the corners of the room, her face etched with a growing sense of unease.
I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong.
She murmured, her voice barely above a whisper.
Do you hear that?
I listened. The house was deathly quiet. The only sound was the creaking of the old timbers, the distant whisper of wind outside. But to Eleanor, every tiny noise seemed amplified, a thudding in the walls, the faint scrape of something against the wood. I tried to convince her that it was just the unfamiliarity of the mansion. Old houses made noises, creaked with age, and nothing more. But the uncertainty in her eyes told me she didn't believe me. Her discomfort began to radiate from her, and I could feel it tightening in my chest as well. I held her, hoping the warmth of my presence would calm her, but it didn't. After a while, she pulled away from me and sat up, her movements jerky.
I need to clear my head,
she said, her voice strained.
I'll go downstairs for a while.
I thought little of it at the time. She was just tired, I assumed, the stress of the wedding catching up with her. But as I lay back, trying to sleep, a gnawing feeling settled in my gut. Something was wrong. The stillness of the house felt suffocating. The darkness seemed to stretch and deepen, pressing in on me. After what felt like hours, I couldn't ignore the unease any longer. I had to check on her. I crept from the bed, my bare feet whispering against the cold floor. The house seemed even quieter than before, if that was possible, an unnatural quiet, as though the very air was holding its breath. Every footstep I took echoed down the long, shadowed hallways, amplifying the sense of dread. When I reached the stairs, they creaked under my weight, the sound so loud in the silence it felt as though the house itself was protesting my presence. The library door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, the dim light from within casting an elongated shadow across the floor. I pushed the door open, but the room was empty. I called out for Eleanor, but my voice felt small in the vast emptiness. My eyes scanned the room, the bookshelves casting long, crooked shadows across the floor. And then I saw it on the reading chair by the fireplace. There was a book, the wedding album. She must have been looking through it, trying to recapture the joy of the day. I reached for the album, my fingers grazing the surface of the worn leather cover. It felt unnaturally heavy, as if the weight of it went beyond the collection of memories it contained. Something about it, something about the way it sat in my hands felt wrong. I hesitated for a moment, but then opened the cover. The faint scent of dust and old paper filled my nostrils, and I began to flip through the pages, my eyes lingering on the first photographs our wedding day, captured in perfect clarity. The images were timeless. There was Eleanor, radiant in her gown, her laughter lighting up the entire frame. There was the arch of roses, the vows we exchanged with all our family and friends watching, their faces full of joy. Each photo was like a scene from a dream I'd thought I was living in. The smiles were so genuine, so unguarded. My heart swelled as I relived the happiness of the day. But as I turned the page, something began to stir uneasily inside me. The images, so seemingly perfect, now struck me as too deliberate, as if the photographer had staged them. The laughter seemed forced, the smiles a little too wide. The light in the photos wasn't just warm. It was almost too bright, too crisp, as though each moment was being preserved in amber, frozen in time, but something had been preserved wrong. I could feel my pulse quicken as I reached the third page, and there it was her, Eleanor, standing at the altar, smiling, holding my hand, her eyes sparkling with love. But behind her the door, the heavy wooden door, was wide open. I hadn't noticed that before. A draft of cold air seemed to pass through me as I glanced quickly behind me, expecting to find the library door slightly ajar, just as in the photo. But no, the door to the library was still firmly closed, its silence suffocating. I shook my head, trying to brush away the feeling that was starting to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a trick of the light. But when I turned the page, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the next photo, standing too close to Eleanor, was a figure. A man, or something like a man. He stood just beyond her, his body too still, his posture too perfect. But it was his face that made my stomach turn. It wasn't a face at all. There was nothing there, just a hollow, featureless void where a face should be. A blackened absence that seemed to suck in the light around it. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just emptiness. My blood ran cold as I stared at the image, frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the void in the figure's head. My breath became shallow, and the world around me seemed to narrow into that blackness. How could I have missed it? How had I not seen him before? I turned the page quickly, trying to push the sudden terror away, telling myself it was just an odd angle, a trick of perspective. But there, in the next photo, the figure was closer, much closer. His form was nearly touching Eleanor's, his presence overwhelming. I could almost feel him leaning in, could almost hear the whisper of his breath in the still air. His arm was raised now, clutching something in his hand. A knife. The blade gleamed under the dim, unnatural light, its edge sharp and cruel. I could almost feel the weight of it in my own hand, could almost hear the soft scrape as it was drawn from the darkness. The faceless man's posture was patient, watching. His head was tilted slightly to one side, as if studying Eleanor, as if waiting for the perfect moment. His expression, if it could be called, that was one of pure, waiting intent. I slammed the album shut, my hands shaking as I stared down at it. The room felt colder now, heavier. The air was thick with an invisible pressure. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. My skin prickled with the sensation. My senses stretched thin as I tried to make sense of the madness in front of me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Eleanor must have found the album, thought it would be a strange surprise for me. Perhaps a joke, something to spook me, a harmless prank. But even as I thought it, the unease gnawed at me, and my mind couldn't silence the fear that twisted through me like a tight knot. The image of the faceless man, that hollow, empty face, how could I explain that? I placed the album back on the chair, my body tense with dread. I tried to breathe, to push the terror away, but it clung to me like a shadow. Then I heard it, a soft sound. Footsteps, slow and uncertain. Eleanor's footsteps. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Eleanor, I called out, but there was no response, no comforting voice to greet me. And then I saw her standing in the doorway, her body rigid, her eyes wide and full of terror. She was staring at the album, her body trembling, her face as pale as the moonlight that streamed through the windows. The fear in her eyes mirrored the same terror that had gripped me when I first saw the photos. She had seen it too. She had seen him. The next morning, I woke up alone. The bed was cold, and the sheets were rumpled, but there was no sign of Eleanor. Panic surged through me as I called her name, rushing through the house, tearing from room to room. The house was deathly quiet, empty. And then I reached the library. A knot of dread twisted in my stomach as I approached the door. It was stuck frozen, unyielding. I pressed my shoulder against it, pushing, the wood creaking under my force. And finally, with a loud crack, it gave way. The door swung open, the creak echoing through the house like a scream. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of Eleanor. And then I saw her. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her limbs bent at angles that couldn't be right. The blood had pooled beneath her, soaking into the old wooden floor. Her eyes were wide open, locked in a silent scream, but her mouth was shut tight, as if she had never had the chance to make a sound. The knife was lodged deep in her back, the blade shining with a cruel, cold gleam. And beside her, the album lay open, its pages fluttering in the still air. The last page was visible. The faceless man, it was him. He was standing behind her, his knife raised high, poised for the strike. It was as though the photo had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her death to come to life. I reached for her, my hands trembling, but it was too late. She was already gone. And then the house. The house was silent once more, the air thick, heavy with the weight of something older than time. The man in the photos was never just a stranger. He was always here. He was always watching. And I had brought him here